So ano ba ang function ng Golgi apparatus? Now, during the board exam, always be careful of qualifier words, no? All of the following, none of the above, not a function. Kasi minsan parang na-excite tayo, ay hala, napaka-simple ng question. Yun pala ang tanong, not a function. Not a function. Pero dito, sa question naman na to, which of the following is a function, no, of the Golgi apparatus? Okay. So ang sagot ng lahat is letter C. Okay, tingnan naman natin. Kasi if you try to eliminate, tingnan niyo yung letter D, formation of ATP. That's the mitochondria, no? Mitochondria. Lipid synthesis, so smooth endoplasmic reticulum. Protein synthesis, rough endoplasmic reticulum, no? Your ribosome. So the answer is letter C, formation of lysosomes, no? Lysosomal formation. So, yung Golgi apparatus kasi natin, it's the packaging center, di ba? You remember it as a packaging center. Let's talk about the endoplasmic reticulum. So, it's a network of tubular and flat vesicular structures. And just remember that your ER is similar, no? By 2 layers din siya. Bilayer din siya, no? And it is contiguous. So it's connected with the plasma membrane. Now you have this space inside the tubules and it's called your endoplasmic matrix. Okay, so your ER could either be rough or granular ER and your smooth ER. Ang nakakapagpa-rough sa kanya is your ribosomes. And when you say ribosomes, ribosomes are the ones that synthesize your proteins, no? Proteins are extruded into your ER matrix. So the proteins are then processed inside the matrix wherein the proteins can be cross-linked, folded, glycosylated, and as well as cleaved, no? So tingnan niyo dito, no, granular glycosylation inside your ER matrix. Your ribosomes are in charge of your protein formation. Your smooth ER is in charge of lipid formation. Okay? Lipid formation. Your lysosomes are ano siya, no, containing your enzymes that digest certain yung mga napapasok sa cell. And then also your Golgi apparatus, yung Golgi, siya yung nagpo-produce ng lysosomes and also it packages, no? It packages substances across the cell as well as your secretory vesicles. So galing yan sa Golgi apparatus. Okay, so common question when regards to smooth ER, you might be asked, no? Lumabas ito sa pharma namin. The patient had an intake of a drug which is lipid-based, no? Lipid-based daw yung drug. So, saan ba daw napoprocess yung lipid-based na drug? So, the answer to that was actually the smooth endoplasmic reticulum, no? Because your smooth endoplasmic reticulum is not only the site of synthesis, no, for your phospholipids and cholesterol, but also it's also in charge, no, of anything na lipid related metabolism. So your smooth ER is a growing ER membrane buds continuously that forms transport vesicles, and these transport vesicles will then migrate to your Golgi apparatus, Now, your Golgi apparatus, its membrane composition is again similar to that, no, of your smooth ER and the plasma membrane, but it is composed of 4 or more stacked layer, no? So, mas madami siyang stacks compared sa endoplasmic reticulum. So, from the smooth ER, it will receive, no, the vesicles from the smooth ER, and then these substances are then processed. So these processes could be either phosphorylation or glycosylation. So these substances, no, para siyang Para siyang Lazada or Shopee transport center, no? Concentrated, sorted, and packaged for secretion dito sa Golgi apparatus. Now, your lysosomes are vesicular organelles. And when you talk about lysosomes, so lysosomal attack, no, it contains lysozymes that digest your bacteria. Okay? It contains lysozymes that digest your bacteria. It contains hydrolytic enzymes nor acid hydrolases. This could include phosphatases, nucleases, proteases, as well as other lipid-degrading enzymes. No? So they can fuse with pinocytotic or phagocytotic vesicles. Pinocytosis, cell drinking; phagocytosis, cell eating. No? So especially for those who substances that are too big to be transported across the cell membrane. So these substances will then be digested by your lysosomes. And that will in turn produce your digestive vesicle, and then the process of extruding it is through your residual body, no? So ipapalabas ng cell. Okay. Peroxisomes. Ano ba yung peroxisomes? From the word itself, oxisomes, no? So they contain oxidases. Okay? They contain oxidases. So lysosomes, usually bacteria degradation. Peroxisomes, oxidases, no? So they oxidize, for example, substances like alcohol that may be otherwise poisonous, no? So they are formed by self-replication, no? Self-replication, itong peroxisomes. As opposed to your lysosomes, which are buds, no? They are bud off from your Golgi apparatus. Okay, alam naman natin ito, no? My primary function is of course for energy, itong mitochondria, and it is accomplished through oxidative phosphorylation. So it has an outer and inner membrane, and along that inner membrane, no, in between that you have your matrix. Okay? So nucleus naman natin is the control center of the cell. So it has again, a double nuclear membrane, and the matrix are contiguous with the endoplasmic reticulum. So magka-contiguous talaga lahat, no? Because your ER is also contiguous with that of your plasma membrane or your cell membrane. Okay, so here, your nuclear membrane has a lot of pores, no? Has a lot of pores in which substances can go in and out of the nucleus, therefore triggering some, for example, DNA control mechanisms, no? So it can turn on or turn off some DNA controllers, no? Within the nucleus. Okay, let's talk about the cytoskeleton. So cytoskeleton, you have four, no? Your intermediate filaments, your microtubules, your thin filaments, and your thick filaments, okay? Intermediate, microtubules, thin filaments, and thick filaments. Now, when you talk about microtubules, no? Microtubule formation, what comes up to mind? Usually spindle fibers, di ba? Spindle fibers. Okay, saan ba nakikita yung spindle fibers? Your spindle fibers are seen in what phase of your cell cycle or cell reproduction? In your mitosis. So, ano nga yung mitosis? PMAT, di ba? So, prophase, metaphase, anaphase, telophase. Appearance of your spindle fiber occurs in what stage? Is it in the prophase, metaphase, anaphase, or telophase? Okay, very good. It's your metaphase, no? Metaphase, dun po lumalabas ang ating mga spindle fibers, which is your microtubule. Okay? Microtubule. Now, when we talk about intermediate filaments, so these are comprised of cell-specific fibrillar monomers. So, for example, keratins, nuclear lamines, vementin, no? And your thin and thick filaments, what comes up to mind is your actin myosin. Okay, actin myosin that are found in your muscle cells. And then as well, your thin filaments make up the stress fibers in your non-muscle cell. Okay, non-muscle cell. Now, cilia and ciliary movements, no? The cilia is composed of 11 microtubules, okay? 11 microtubules. It has 9 double tubules and 2 single tubules. This 9 double tubules and 2 single tubule comprises what you call your axoneme, no? So just remember that your cilia again is an outgrowth of your basal body, and it is covered through budding from your plasma membrane as well. So contiguous din siya, no, sa plasma membrane. Okay, as you can see here in the picture. So basal body, and from the basal body, dun tumutubo ang cilium natin, which is composed of 9 double and 2 single tubules. So, is your ciliary movement ATP or energy dependent? Yes, it is energy dependent, no? And also it requires calcium and magnesium in order to function. Okay. So what is that syndrome wherein there is ciliary dyskinesia? And usually, meron po tayong mga pasyente na pumupunta sa atin because of recurrent respiratory infections or sinusitis, no? So, very good, cartagenars, okay? And cartagenars is associated with what? Heart abnormality. Sabihin natin heart abnormality. What do you usually see together with your, okay, eto, no? Situs inversus. Situs inversus is also commonly seen in patients with Cartagener syndrome, no? So, actually, yung ano namin sa Philippine Society of Hypertension, no? I think she's the vice president, no, of the PSH. So, she is she's also a patient with Cartageners, no? And she lived long. She lives a very active lifestyle. It's just very important to really, vaccinate them well, give them flu and pneumococcal vaccines, make sure that when they have respiratory infections, you immediately, take a look at the possibility of giving antibiotics, and especially respiratory toilet, no? So dapat yung mga secretions nalalabas talaga. So very, very vigorous chest tapping, and then also any other maneuvers, no, para malabas yung phlegma. Kasi ito yung problema ng Cartageners because impaired ang ciliary movement, then hindi din makalabas yung phlegma. Okay, and they also have problems with reproduction, no? Because your cilia can also be found in your fallopian tube, no? In your fallopian tube. Okay, so I have a question here. Which of the following is the principal site of detoxification and metabolism of lipid-soluble exogenous drug? Is it your rough ER, smooth ER, C, Golgi apparatus, or D, your mitochondria? Parang nagkamali ako ng lagay ng slide na ito, no? It should have been earlier. Okay, alam na nila yung sagot. Of course, na-mention ko kanina, no? It is your smooth endoplasmic reticulum. Okay? So, dapat hindi na tayo magkamali kung lalabas ito sa exam. Dapat sagot na agad. Okay. Yon, nagkamali talaga pala ako naglagay ng slide, no? Okay, so next question. What is the most abundant lipid in the cell membrane lipid bilayer? Okay, so sa lipid bilayer ng cell membrane natin, what is the most abundant lipid found? Is it A, cholesterol, B, phospholipids, C, sphingolipids, or is it your glycolipids? Glycolipids. Okay, tingnan natin yung mga sagot. Okay. Answer mostly is letter B, no? Which is correct, no? Phospholipids po ang pinaka-abundant natin na lipid sa cell membrane lipid bilayer. So your cell membrane is composed of, you have integral proteins and then other transmembrane proteins, and that is composing 55% no, of the entire cell membrane. Pero ang tanong kasi natin is the most abundant lipid. And the most abundant lipid is your phospholipids, comprising about 25%. Next to that is your cholesterol. And you have other lipids and carbohydrates. And when we're talking about carbohydrates, your carbohydrates include your glycocalyx, no? Etong glycocalyx, itong nasa labas, no? Outer surface natin, na para siyang mga 3 branches, no? So those are loosely stuck carbohydrate moieties that are found studded on your outer surface that is in charge of antigenicity of a cell. Okay? So the phosphate, you have a phosphate end and a fatty acid end, no, in your phospholipid. So phosphate end is hydrophilic and your fatty acid end is hydrophobic. That's why your phosphate end is pointed outwards. Okay? So ano ba yung mga pumapasok sa lipid bilayer? Your lipid bilayer is permeable to oxygen, carbon dioxide, and alcohol. Meanwhile, ions, glucose, and urea need transport mechanisms, no, or carrier proteins for them to cross the lipid bilayer because they are impermeable to the cell membrane. Okay? So for example, your ions, glucose, and your urea. Na-mention na naman ni Doc, no? Si Doc talaga mahilig mahilig mag-advance. The outside surface of the cell is lined by a loose carbohydrate coating, no? Called, is it A, or glycolipids, B, glycoproteins, C, glycosides, or D, glycocalyx? Of course, nasabi ko na kanina, it is letter D, glycocalyx, no? Glycocalyx. So please do not get confused, no? Kasi sometimes parang when we read kasi the question, ang hirap naman ito, hindi ko alam kung anong sagot, no? Pero when you look closely, of course, ang tanong, loose carbohydrate coating. Bakit lipid? Bakit protein ang sasagutin mo, no? Eh meron nang nakalagay diyan glycolipid, glycoprotein. So X na 'yon. So if you don't know the answer to a question, you just take a look at the choices. So kung alam mo naman na A at B ay hindi na tamang sagot kasi lipid at protein na yan, carbohydrate tinatanong, at least you have 50% chance na, no? Between C and D. So mas mataas na yung chances mo of winning. Oo. So you need to just take a look at the choices. Okay. Proteins provide specificity to a membrane. So it is defined according to its mode of association. So it could be either integral or peripheral. When we say integral protein, it spans the entire span of your lipid bilayer or your cell membrane. So from end to end. Yan yung integral. And if it spans the entire membrane, then that integral protein is usually a carrier, a channel, a pore, no? Because it allows certain substances to be transported across the cell membrane. When we say peripheral, nasa periphery lang siya, no? So it could be intracellular signal mediator protein or it could be containing enzymes, no? Those are your peripheral proteins. Now, your glycocalyx is composed of glycolipids, approximately 10%, your glycoproteins, which are majority of your integral proteins, and your proteoglycans, okay? Proteoglycans. So these negative charge of your carbohydrate chain repels other negative charges, so therefore, they are also involved in cell-to-cell attachments or interactions. Now, very important, these glycocalyx, or carbohydrates found in your glycocalyx, plays a role in immune reaction. Okay? In immune reaction. So if ang tanong, which Which substance in your cell membrane is in charge of immune reaction? So your answer would be your glycocalyx, no? Glycocalyx. Your cholesterol is present in membranes in varying amounts, no? So it generally decreases membrane fluidity and permeability, and it increases the flexibility and stability of your lipid bilayer. Okay? Of your lipid bilayer. Okay. Very common question. Hindi talaga nawawala sa board exam ang cell transport mechanism, no? So kahit mag-ano pa tayo, magpustahan pa tayo, may lalabas talagang osmosis, passive transport, active transport. So you should already have a concept map, no? Meron na dapat kayong concept map na ano ba yung mga ibig sabihin ng down an electrochemical gradient? Ano bang ibig sabihin ng against an electrochemical gradient? So the question here is, which of these transport mechanism across cell membrane occurs down an electrochemical gradient? Is it A, a counter-transport mechanism? Or is it B, a primary active transport mechanism? Or letter C, carrier-mediated transport? Or letter D, facilitated diffusion? Okay. So, majority answered letter D. Okay. Kasi, let's attack the question, ha? Let's go to the stem of the question. Ang tanong ay, ano ba daw na transport mechanism across a cell membrane occurs down an electrochemical gradient? So, when you say down an electrochemical gradient from high concentration to low concentration, and it does not require any energy. Okay? Does not require energy. Meanwhile, if it says against an electrochemical gradient, no? Against siya. So from low to high, then of course you need energy, no, to transport that substance. And when you need energy, of course, it's ATP dependent. So it is an active transport mechanism. So kung atakihin natin ang mga choices, you look at A, B, and C. A, B, and C all need energy. Okay? It all needs energy kasi counter-transport yan eh. You need energy, no? To go against the electrochemical gradient. It says active. Active na yan eh. So it needs energy. If carrier-mediated naman, of course, the carrier needs energy, no? In order to transport the mechanism. So of course, the answer will be facilitated diffusion. Dito tayo nalilito sa facilitated eh. Kasi pag nabasa natin, ay hala, facilitated, baka kailangan ng energy yan. No, hindi. It's a passive transport mechanism. So ganun po yung pag-atake natin ng mga question, ha. So wag po tayong magmadali when answering questions. You have 2 hours to answer your physiology exam. Those 2 hours, you should really read the question twice or thrice, no? Take your time. Take your time. Kasi each item counts. At sayang naman, ganito ka-simple na question, no? Nagkamali pa tayo. Kasi naging careless tayo sa pagsasagot. Okay? So letter D po ang sagot natin dyan. Of course, you also take note that if the question is very simple, of course, it will have an MPL of 1. No? MPL of 1 siya. So dapat nakuha mo talaga yung sagot na yon, no? Kung hindi mo siya makuha, sayang. Sayang talaga. Okay, so this is a rough concept map, no, of molecules that crosses your cell membrane. I usually advocate the use of concept map to my students, especially, no, na pag mga complex na mga subjects. Kasi using the concept map, alam mo na kung saan papunta eh. Alam mo na kung ano yung ending, alam mo yung process, bakit naging ganito, bakit ito yung ginagamit, bakit ito yung medicine na ibibigay, no? Maganda yung mag-concept mapping ka. So, your cell membrane transport mechanism can either be passive or active. And when you say active, it moves against an concentration gradient, and if passive, it moves down or along a concentration gradient. And from the word itself, active, of course, it requires ATP. And if it's passive, it may be simple diffusion or facilitated diffusion. Simple diffusion is just diffusion of small non-polar molecules. Meanwhile, your facilitated diffusion is transport of polar molecules and ions. Okay? Now, it's called facilitated diffusion because some of them uses transport proteins as well. Okay? In order to transport these polar molecules and ions. I hope that's clear, ha? So wag nang malito sa moving along, moving down, moving against. Kasi minsan yung ibang student nalilito. Okay, dito na tayo sa madugong transcription, elongation, ano pa yan, Okazaki fragments. Okay. So ano ba yung transcription? Overview. So rough overview, you have 5 steps, no? So your RNA polymerase will bind to your promoter sequence and your polymerase will then unwind. You need to unwind the DNA double helix, no? So kasi 'di ba naka-twist 'yan yung double helix mo. So your RNA polymerase will temporarily unwind your DNA double helix. Then your polymerase will then read, no, the DNA strand, and then once it has read the DNA strand, it will add complementary RNA molecules to the template, no? And this activated RNA molecule will then grow end to end, no, from your RNA strand, and they will add additional RNA molecules in the 3' end. Okay? Now, your transcription will then end when the RNA polymerase will reach a terminating sequence, thus releasing both your polymerase and your RNA strand. Meanwhile, so that's transcription, no? That's transcription. Your messenger RNA is complementary in sequence to your DNA coding strands, no? So it is usually organized by codon. And codon are triplet amino acid bases, okay? So for example, you have your start codon. Each amino acid has a specific codon, no? It could be a GU, GUA, no? Depende yan. Pero yung isang amino acid, meron talaga siyang corresponding na codon. And you have start and stop codon, no? So itong stop codon, lumabas ito sa amin eh. Wala lang, trip lang ng examiner, no? So you need to remember. So itong stop codon, madali lang naman, no? So kung Bisaya ka, yung UA, UAA, 'di ba parang uwa ng ng sanggol. Uwa, umiiyak yung sanggol. Tapos yung UAG, uwag. Uwag kasi sa amin sa Bisaya ay libog, no? So nalilibugan daw basta pag teenager. Tapos uga, ang ibig sabihin ng uga sa amin dry na, no? So dry ka na daw pag nasa elderly. So yung stop ko doon, ang joke namin dito is the life cycle. Bata ka, iiyak, uwag, malilibugan during teenager, tapos yung uga, dry ka na, no? During elderly. So hindi masyadong makagets yung mga hindi Bisaya, no? Pero yung start ko doon, ayon, AUG talaga yan, ha? If start ko doon, it is AUG. Ewan ko ba doon sa examiner na yun, pinalabas talaga yung stop ko doon, no? So just be familiar with the start and stop ko doon. Okay. When you see transfer RNA acts as a carrier molecule, no? Carrier molecule during your protein synthesis. As you can see here, no, you have your ribosomes, and then your transfer RNA will read the triplet amino acid bases or the codon, and because of the triplet amino acid bases, it will encode for a specific protein, whether a specific amino acid, whether it is proline, serine, phenylalanine, alanine. Kaya nga minsan pag nagkakamali, 'di ba, ang isang base pairing, it will produce a different amino acid, and that different amino acid in the protein chain will cause certain dysfunction in the product protein, no? So base pairing na mga mismatch. Okay. So your tRNA recognizes a specific codon by way of a complementary anticodon on your tRNA molecule. Okay. So tapos na tayo doon sa transcription, and then of course your messenger and transfer RNA. Let's talk about the specific protein formation. So you have your phase 1, no, your initiation. In your initiation, you have your tRNA, which will bind to the 5' end of an mRNA molecule. And then this mRNA molecule will then move until it encounters a start codon. And your start codon is AUG. And AUG also codes for methionine, no? Met. Now, once it encounters a start codon, then it will start na encoding your protein, no? Yung isa-isang amino acid. So initiation factors dissociate and your large ribosomal subunit will then bind. Now, elongation is the process wherein your amino acid tRNA will bind to your ribosomal A site, and then through your peptidyl transferase, no? Yung mga tRNA maglilink-link siya with your amino acid chain, no, until ma-elongate natin yung amino acid chain natin based on the specific instructions of the codon. When you encounter the stop codon, then yung uwag, uga, tsaka yung uwa, then it will stop, no? And then it will release the completed polypeptide. When you say polypeptide, amino acid chain siya. And then your ribosome will then dissociate into its 2 subunits. Okay? So, paano ba nakokontrol natin yung transcription? Through your operon. Okay? Through your operon. So, the operon is a series of genes with their shared regulatory elements. No? So, itong operon kasi natin, meron siyang activator, repressor, and promoter. So, these gene products will contribute, no, to a common process. Your structural gene A will produce your enzyme A, and this enzyme A will become substrate that will produce a synthesized product. And this synthesized product will either inhibit, promote, activate, or repress. Yun lang talaga yung operon, kung anong ibig sabihin ng operon, no? Through your operon and then your structural genes, it will produce specific substrates and products which will in turn, no, tell your operon na, oy, wag nang gawin yan. Okay na ako. Repress mo na yan. Inhibit mo na yan. Or it will also activate. Okay? So yun lang po talaga yung ibig sabihin ng operon. Okay. So tapos na tayo sa transcription. Just be familiar, no, with the steps. Kasi usually yung mga tinatanong lang naman yan. During the process of transcription, blah, 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 your codon will bind with your ribosomal unit, and then it will encounter this specific start and stop codon, no? So ganun yung mga question usually. So saan ba daw yan? Sa transcription ba daw yan? Or sa elongation? So you might encounter those questions, no? Okay, question. What is the first step in cell reproduction? What is the first step in your cell reproduction? Is it A, mitosis, B, meiosis? Is it letter C, DNA synthesis, or letter D, enzyme activation? What is the first step in cell reproduction? No? So, very tricky question, no? Kasi ang alam natin, first step. Di ba ang first step is prophase? So ano ba yung interphase? Ano ba yung G1? Ano ba yung S phase? Ano ba yung resting phase, no? So ang tinatanong kasi dito is cell reproduction. Cell reproduction. So hindi siya cell life cycle, no? So the answers are, ano ba ang answer? Enzyme activation ng answer, no? Ng karamihan. Yung iba naman letter C. So actually yung sagot, no, na-encounter ko dito is mitosis. Ang weird, no? Oo. Pero kasi ang tanong niya is cell reproduction. And cell reproduction, the first stage is your prophase, which is part of your mitosis. Okay? So yung mitosis is cell reproduction. Yung meiosis naman is gamete formation, di ba? So from 46 chromosomes, magiging 23 siya. Okay? So yun yung meiosis natin. Yung DNA synthesis naman natin occurs during the cell resting stage. And you don't need enzymes to be activated in order to be the catalyst, no, for cell reproduction. Okay? So you have here the M phase, which is the active phase, no, of your cell reproduction, and then your interphase, wherein the resting phase ito. You have your G1 phase and then your S phase and your G2 phase. Okay? So your M phase, active cell reproduction, that includes your mitosis and your cytokinesis. And under your mitosis, you have your PMAT. Okay? PMAT. So in the DNA replication or in your S phase, it is switched on, no, by your S phase activator. And then the replication is again initiated at the replication origin and proceeds in both directions, and the entire genome, no, is replicated once. It usually involves again your DNA polymerase, which will unbind, stabilize the DNA and replicate it along the lagging strand. Okay? And then, therefore, it forms your Okazaki fragments. When you say Okazaki fragments, it is on the lagging strand. Just take note of these generalities. Kasi ito, generalities na lang yung mga binibigay kong points. When you talk about adding nucleotides, either be it in DNA or RNA, just remember that your nucleotides are always added at the 3' end. Kasi di ba 3' and 5' yan? 3' and 5' end. So nucleotides are always added to the 3' end, either be DNA or RNA. And your Okazaki fragments are formed in your lagging strand. Proofreading of your new DNA is by your DNA polymerase and when you need repair because of base mismatch or base substitutions, or when there are gaps because of radiation. So that is usually repaired by your DNA ligase. Ano ba yung ginagawa ng DNA ligase natin? Once it reaches, nakita niya, ay bungi, no? Mali. Pinuputol niya ligate from the word, no? Ligate. Pinuputol at nire-repair niya yung base na yon. Okay. So new DNA helices associate with histones in order to form your chromosomes, and the two chromosomes remain temporarily attached at the centromere. And together, these chromosomes are then called your chromatids. Okay? So ito po yung ating PMAT, no? So your active phase, mitosis plus your cytokinesis. So just take note of the very important details no, occurring on each phases. Kung prophase, yan yung first phase natin, the chromosomes begin to condense and will become visible. And take note, spindle fibers. Spindle fibers will emerge no, from your centrosomes. But your mitotic spindle microtubules will be fully developed, no? Fully developed in the metaphase. So tama po yung mga sagot natin kanina. Na pag mitotic spindle na po ang pinag-usapan natin, then that is in the metaphase. Okay? Metaphase. So sa prophase, what you need to remember is condensation of your chromosomes, and your nuclear envelope and your nucleolus begins to disappear. In your metaphase, ang usual na lumalabas is itong pag fully developed ng mitotic spindle, and also that the chromosomes are lined at the center of the metaphase plate. Okay? Nasa sentro na po ang chromosomes natin dito. Okay, now when you talk about anaphase, no? Anaphase is when your sister chromatids will begin to be pulled towards the opposite poles. Okay? Opposite poles. And yung poles natin is your kinetochore. Okay? Your kinetochore. Meanwhile, in your telophase is marked by the arrival of your chromosomes. Nasa opposite poles na siya. and then your nuclear envelope begins to surround, no, the new set of chromosomes, and the mitotic spindle begins to break down. Okay, so mind mapping: prophase, condensation of chromosomes becomes visible, breaking down of the nuclear envelope. Metaphase, mitotic spindle, chromosomes lined up at the center. Anaphase, nagpo-pull out na sila, no? Your chromatids, sister chromatids, are now in the opposite poles. Telophase, mitotic spindle breaks down, chromosomes have already arrived at the opposite poles, and then they will begin to develop their own nuclear envelope. Okay, so much for the cell, no, physiology. So usually yun naman kasi talaga yung mga lumalabas, no, sa cell physiology. So cell physiology, transport mechanism, cell organelles, specific functions, lipid bilayer, cell membrane, yun talaga yung mga usual. So you focus on those, no, on those things. Okay, I have a question here. Why will a cardiac muscle stop beating in a calcium-free solution as opposed to a skeletal muscle? No? Pag calcium-free solution ba daw, bakit ang cardiac muscle will stop beating? Ang hirap naman yan, Doc. Walang choices. Hindi ko nalagyan ng choices. Pero actually, ang answer nito is that your ano kasi, T-tubules of your cardiac muscle cell opens directly, no, to your extracellular fluid. So therefore, because meron siyang direct connection between your extracellular fluid and your cardiac muscle cell due to your T-tubule, then if you have the same extracellular fluid concentration na walang calcium, pumupunta yan yung solution na yan na walang calcium papunta sa cardiac muscle cell, and you need the calcium in order for your cardiac muscle cell to be activated, no? So that's why it will stop beating. Okay, tingnan po natin yung differences ng skeletal at cardiac, no? You don't have gap junctions in your skeletal muscle, but you do have gap junctions in your cardiac muscle. And as you can see here, no, of course, alam naman natin, no, involuntary yung cardiac, of course. But take a look at the source of the calcium. The source of the calcium for your skeletal system, skeletal muscle, is only your sarcoplasmic reticulum. Okay, sarcoplasmic reticulum. Meanwhile, the source of calcium for your cardiac muscle is your sarcoplasmic reticulum and extracellular fluid. Okay? Kaya po, pag meron po tayong pasyente na may hypokalemia, no, we give them calcium gluconate in order to stabilize your cardiac muscle cell. Okay? So, your cardiac muscle cell also has its own pacemaker, no? As opposed to skeletal, wala siyang own pacemaker. Hindi siya paced, no? So wala siyang rhythmicity. Okay, so cell characteristic, binucleated, and then with striations for both skeletal and your cardiac muscle with striations. Okay, very usual question. Meron talagang lalabas na ionic potentials, resting membrane potential, muscle activation, nerve activation, as well as heart muscle activation. No? So those are very, very common questions that will come out in the boards. So question here is, the resting membrane potential is determined by conductance of which of the following ions? Is it A, sodium? Is it B, potassium? C, calcium? Or D, chloride? Okay. So just take a look at the question. It's not asking about cell activation. Okay? It's not asking about cell activation. Ano ba yung pumapasok na ion na pag pumasok itong ion na ito, it will cause cell activation? That is sodium, right? So X na yung sodium. It's not sodium. So, which of the remaining three, either potassium, calcium, or chloride, the conductance of which will push your membrane potential down to negative 75 millivolts? And the answer is letter B, potassium. Okay? It's potassium that will push your membrane potential down to the RMP, which is negative 75 millivolts. Okay? Sige. So as you can see here, no? Take a look at your phases of your action potential and the associated ionic currents, no? So as you can see in your phase 0 upstroke to 1, which is your activation, it is caused by the inward movement of your sodium. So yung sodium, pagpasok niya, yun yung nakakapag-push ng RMP towards activation positive side. Meanwhile, para bumalik, no? Para bumalik yung RMP down to etong 4, stage 4, you need the conductance of your potassium. Okay? Potassium, which is flowing outwards of the cell in order to push, no? In order to push your RMP down to negative 70 to negative 80 millivolts. So, phase 0 is depolarization. Depolarization. And when you talk about depolarization, that is the time wherein your fast sodium channels begin to open. So yung sodium natin nagra-rush in towards your cell. Inwards. Inward rushing of your sodium. Meanwhile, your phase 1 is your initial repolarization. Tingnan nyo yung parang dip, no? Nag-dip siya ng konti. That dip is because of the closure of your fast sodium channels. Now, your phase 2 or plateau is when your calcium channels begin to open. And the opening of your calcium channels will pull, no, calcium ions going inwards into the cell. And then your fast potassium channels during your plateau will begin to close, no? Your fast potassium channels will close. In your phase 3 or in your rapid repolarization rate, your slow potassium channels open and your calcium channels begin to close. And this closure of your calcium, kasi itong calcium will bring ionic current inward, thus pushing it to the negative side. But then, pag close ng calcium channels, no? Pag close ng calcium channels, then it will cause your repolarization, and then your slow potassium channels will now begin to open. And as you can see in your phase 4 or in your resting membrane potential, the ionic current that is predominant here in this phase is your outward movement of your potassium or potassium efflux. Okay? Potassium efflux. So yung usual naman na tanong dito is phase 0 depolarization, sodium going in. And then phase 2 plateau, your calcium begins to go in and the calcium channels are open. Meanwhile, your fast potassium channels are closed. And then in your phase 4 or RMP, your potassium is still going out of the cell. Potassium efflux. That's what you need to remember. Okay? Sige. Which electrolytes are largely responsible for the maintenance of a prolonged period of cardiac depolarization or plateau? Okay, plateau ang tinatanong. Is it A, calcium potassium, B, calcium sodium, C, sodium potassium, or D, calcium? Okay, let's see your answers. So the answer is calcium sodium, no? Calcium sodium. Okay, bakit calcium at sodium? Calcium sodium. So here in your phase 4 is your RMP. So ang potassium mo is going to the extracellular fluid, no? So nagkamali tayong lahat, no? Calcium potassium yung sinagot natin. Bakit calcium sodium ang sagot, Doc? Teka ha, parang nagkamali ako ng answer. Teka. Hindi calcium sodium ang sagot, calcium potassium. Tama po tayong lahat, no? Nagkamali ako ng highlight ng sagot. So it's calcium, sodium. Calcium, potassium. Okay? Calcium, potassium ang answer for plateau. Because as what we have discussed no earlier, your phase 4 or your RMP, it will pull no your potassium outwards and inwards of your sodium activation phase 0, and then closure of your sodium will produce your initial repolarization in phase 1, and then in your phase 2 this is the movement of your calcium and potassium. Okay, so ang sagot po ay calcium, potassium for the plateau phase. Okay, at what phase of your ventricular action potential will calcium conductance decrease? Decrease po ang tanong natin dito. Calcium conductance. Calcium conductance. Is it phase 0, 1, 2, or 3? Is it phase 0, 1, 2, or 3? Okay, most of you answered letter D, phase 3 daw. And the answer is indeed phase 3. Very good, no? Increased calcium conductance happens in your phase 3. Okay, the inherent leakiness of the sinus nodal fibers to what ions causes its self-excitation? Kasi di ba yung sinus node natin meron siyang rhythmicity and automaticity. So what are the ions that are responsible for the rhythmicity and automaticity and self-excitation of your sinus node? Is it A, because of your sodium and calcium? Is it B, sodium and chloride? C, sodium and potassium? Or D, potassium and calcium? Okay, inherent leakiness of your sinus nodal fibers to what ions causes their self-excitation? Okay, let's take a look at your answers. Most of you answered letter A. Some answered letter C, some answered letter D, no? Okay. So the correct answer is letter A, sodium and calcium, no? Sodium and calcium. So sodium and calcium is primarily responsible no, for the leakiness of your sinus node, in which it will gradually push no, your electrical potential down to its resting membrane potential. But then there is a threshold for discharge na pag umabot siya ng negative 40, then it will cause self-excitation. And then because of your sodium, because of your sodium and calcium, it will then push again no, back towards your resting membrane potential. And because of this threshold for discharge, once your sinus node is activated, it will also activate, therefore, your ventricular muscle fiber. Paano ba niya ina-activate? So from the sinus node, it will travel, the discharge or the electrical activity will travel towards your internodal pathways, going to your AV node. And from your AV node, it will go to your bundle of His, towards your left and right bundle branches. And then also take note that you have your interatrial pathway. Okay? Interatrial pathway that conducts the discharges from the right atrium going into the left atrium. And the delay, no? The delay between the beating of your atria and your ventricle is due to your AV bundle. AV bundle, no? Because that AV bundle, that delay is needed in order to prime, in order to push the blood from your atria going into the ventricle para puno ang ventricle natin when it becomes activated. Okay? Sige, let's talk about the cardiac cycle, no? Cardiac cycle hindi nawawala. Cardiac cycle events that occur at the beginning of a heartbeat and last until the beginning of the next heartbeat. So, natatandaan ko pa, tinanong yung location ng sinus node. Tapos yung question pa na yun, which seemed rather very anatomical ang question, it actually came out in the physio, no? So, do not be phased, no? Remain unfazed with questions that seems to be very, very out of place, no? Meron ding tanong na feedback sa akin na may tanong daw na which wave seen in your ECG corresponds to what brain activity daw, no? Yung tinatanong pala is EEG. EEG na brainwave, pero ang na-type is ECG wave, no? So do not be fazed with that. So sometimes meron kasing mga typo yung mga question. Okay? And then, di ba, during ano natin, med school, ayaw talaga ng mga professors natin na naglalagay ng mga except, not, no? Pero sa board exam, whether we like it or not, lalabas talaga yung mga except, none of the above, all of the above, not, no? Bawal na kasi dapat yon, no? Pero minsan lumalabas pa rin. Okay, so itong sinus node, it initiates your action potential and its location is in the right atrium near your superior vena cava. Okay, ito yung tinanong sa amin na lumabas sa physio. RA near your SVC. Okay, so there is an AV nodal delay of about 0.13 seconds, which, as I've said earlier, allows the atria to contract, no, before the ventricles. So your P wave is corresponding to your depolarization, and because of that depolarization, it will cause atrial contraction. QRS, ventricular depolarization, and T wave is repolarization. Now, 80% of the ventricular filling occurs during diastole. Okay, so when the question is, majority of the blood that flows towards your ventricle happens during, the answer is during relaxation, no? Because diastole is ventricular relaxation. Okay? So 80% of filling occurs during diastole, and actually the atrial contraction, no, provides only 20% of the ventricular filling. It's also called the atrial kick. Now, we have different venous waveforms. So your A wave actually denotes your atrial contraction. Meanwhile, your C wave occurs during ventricular contraction, and this C wave is actually produced because of pag-contract ng ventricles mo, yung AV valves mo will bulge. Magte-tent siya ng konti. And that small tenting, that small bulging will produce your C wave. And your V wave is produced by infilling of the atria from your venous return. Doc, bakit binibigay mo pa yan? Ano bang importance ng mga venous waveform? Because lumabas na din, no? The question was, which of the following waveforms are absent during atrial fibrillation? Okay? Which of the following waveforms is absent during atrial fibrillation? Is it A wave, C wave, or V wave? So the answer is A wave, no? Kasi A wave po natin is in charge of atrial contraction. Hindi in charge, pero seen in your atrial contraction. Okay, so what are the different diastole events, no? Diastole events, kasi usual question yan eh. Which of the following events occur during diastole? Which of the following events are seen, no, in conjunction with diastole? So it is actually isovolumic relaxation. And then when ventricular pressure will decrease below that of your atria, your AV valves will then begin to open. Okay? Mag-o-open siya. And when it has opened, then that will produce rushing of the blood. And the rushing of the blood will give you 80%, no? 80% of the filling. That's your period of rapid filling. And then your atrial kick will just give 20 to 25%, no, of the filling. Meanwhile, in your systole events, when you talk about systole, so eto, contraction siya. Contraction. So, when it contracts, your ventricle contracts. Kasi yung AV valve, di ba? AV valve is from the atria to the ventricle. And your semilunar is your atrial, tawag nito? Your pulmonary and also your aortic valve, no? So when your ventricles will contract, of course, it needs to push the blood towards your pulmonary vasculature and also towards your aortic arch. So therefore, your AV valves should be closed para mag-travel ang blood towards your pulmonic or towards your aortic valve. So in the period of isovolumic contraction, there's no outflow of blood yet, no, for about 0.2 to 0.3 seconds. But when your LV pressure will exceed the aortic pressure, it needs to exceed kasi 80 millimeters mercury in order for the blood to be pumped out, no? In order for the blood to be pumped out. And when the pressure also exceeds that of the pulmonary artery pressure of 8, then you will have your ventricular outflow. And that will mark the period of ejection. Now, in the period of ejection, rapid ejection is the first part, and most blood is ejected in your rapid ejection. In the slow ejection, aortic pressure slightly exceeds that of your ventricular pressure. So this is just due to the kinetic energy potential of your ventricular muscle. And your last period of systole is when you have your ventricular pressure that falls below your aortic and pulmonic artery pressure, no? So bumaba na siya, less than 80 and less than 8. So pag bumaba na siya, of course, your aortic and pulmonic will then shut off. Okay, so general cardiovascular physiology. General must-knows lang natin, no? So your oxygen consumption depends on the pressure volume type of work of the heart. The greater the heart pumps, no, the greater the heart needs to work, of course, the oxygen consumption will increase. So it is proportional to the tension, no? To the tension multiplied by the time the tension is maintained to the heart. So what is the Laplace law? Okay, Laplace law. Laplace law is the wall tension in the heart is proportional to the pressure times the diameter of the ventricle. Okay? So ang wall tension natin is directly proportional to the pressure plus the diameter of the ventricle. Meanwhile, when you talk about iba naman yon, no, yung ano natin, yung isang law natin which we will discuss later. Your ventricular wall tension increases at high systolic pressure or when the heart is dilated. Okay, when we talk about sympathetic stimulation, sympathetic increased cardiac output, no? Take note that your heart has a resting sympathetic tone. Why? Of course, it has a resting sympathetic tone because we need to continuously pump blood. Okay? So parasympathetic stimulation, decreasing of your cardiac output and your heart rate mainly affects your atria. Okay? Atria ang kanyang effect, hindi sa ventricles. So it decreases your chronotropic and inotropic effect. Okay? So excess potassium in the ECF will cause a flaccid heart and less contractility. Meanwhile, excess calcium will produce spasticity. Okay? Spastic heart. Hypercalcemia will cause tetany. Okay? Tetany or spasticity. That's why when you have hyperkalemia, what do we do in order to stabilize the heart in cases of hyperkalemia? We give calcium gluconate. We give injections of calcium gluconate in order to counteract the effect of potassium in the ECF, which is less contractility and flaccid heart. You need to give the calcium gluconate in order to stabilize the heart membrane and to avert the impending cardiovascular collapse, no? Kasi magsa-stop beat ng heart mo if excessive na yung potassium. Very commonly seen, no? Especially for those who have missed their dialysis session. Okay, so how does your parasympathetic slow down the cardiac output and the heart rate, no? So it exerts its effect through your acetylcholine, no? Release of your acetylcholine. This acetylcholine will slow the rate of your sinus node discharge and decrease the excitability of your atria and your AV node. Plus, it increases the permeability of your sinus node and your AV junctional fibers to your potassium, causing hyperpolarization. Hyperpolarization. And hyperpolarization means relaxation. Okay? Relaxation. So as you can see, no, ang parasympathetic effects usually confined in the atria, not in your ventricles. All of its effect is in the atria, sinus node, AV node, AV junctional fibers. Okay? So dun po ang effect ng parasympathetic nerve fibers. And the predominant neurotransmitter is acetylcholine. Meanwhile, when we talk about sympathetic, it causes release of norepinephrine. And this norepinephrine neurotransmitter will increase the discharge of your sinus node, increase the conduction of cardiac impulses, and take a look here, no? Ang sympathetic affects both atria and the ventricle. Okay? It increases the force of contraction in both atria and ventricular muscle fibers. Now, your norepinephrine will also increase the permeability to sodium and calcium. And sodium and calcium are activators in the heart. Okay? So, it will increase the heart rate plus the contractility of the heart. Okay? Kasi yung calcium, di ba, for force of contraction, sodium activation of your cardiac impulses. So it will cause increase in your heart rate and contractility. So remember, parasympathetic, acetylcholine, potassium, hyperpolarization. Meanwhile, sympathetic, norepinephrine, sodium, and calcium ion conductance. Ang lumabas kasi dito na tanong was, your sympathetic nerve fibers exert its increased inotropic and chronotropic effect through conductance of which ions. And the choices were sodium, potassium, chloride, and calcium. No? And then ang nasagot ng karamihan ay potassium, which is wrong. No? Which is wrong. It's actually sodium or calcium. Sodium or calcium for sympathetic nerve fibers. Okay. Enough of that. Let's go to the different heart murmurs. No? So, just always remember PMAT. Ano ba yung ano namin dito? Please answer my telephone. Please answer my telephone. So, pulmonic best heard in your left second intercostal space. Aortic best heard in your right second intercostal space. Your mitral is in the left fifth intercostal medial to your mid-clavicular line. And then your tricuspid is in the lower left sternal border in your fourth intercostal space. No? Pero dito, all people enjoy Time Magazine. No? Kasi yung Herb's point is the best point wherein you can hear both your S1 and your S2, which is in the left third intercostal space. Okay, so let's differentiate the different systolic and diastolic murmur. Kasi lalabas talaga yung mga murmur. You need to master the different heart murmurs, no? For you to be able to answer your physiology boards. So, systolic murmurs, please sneak away slowly, Mr. Tiger. So, pulmonic stenosis, aortic stenosis, mitral regurgitation, and tricuspid regurgitation. Meanwhile, your diastolic murmurs are arms parts, no? Arms parts. So, aortic regurgitation, mitral stenosis, pulmonary regurgitation, tricuspid stenosis. Doc, ang hirap naman, hindi talaga mapasok. So, just try to understand what happens in the generation of your systolic murmur, no? So, when you talk about systolic murmurs, these are murmurs that involve blood leaving the ventricles. Okay? Blood leaving the ventricles. So, leaving the ventricles meaning papunta sa aorta and papunta sa pulmonary. Okay? Pulmonary. Okay. So, your mitral and your tricuspid guards your atria going into the ventricle. And then your semilunar valves guard between your ventricles going to the pulmonary vasculature or your systemic circulation, your aorta. So your systolic murmurs will occur when the blood begins to leave the ventricles. So, for example, in cases of mitral regurgitation murmur happens because your blood that is supposed to be leaving towards your mitral siya eh. Mitral, di ba? So, nasa left side. So, mitral from the ventricle going into the aorta. But then some of the blood will regurgitate back into the atria. That is your mitral regurgitation. So that's why you hear MR in your systolic murmur. Meanwhile, you also hear aortic stenosis because in aortic stenosis, the blood will leave the ventricle from the ventricle going to the aorta. And because of the stenosis, it will produce the systolic murmur, as well as your hypertrophic obstructive cardiomyopathy or HOCM, no? So that is systolic murmur. Meanwhile, your diastolic murmur involves blood going into your ventricles, entering the ventricles. So from the atria, from the left atria going to your left ventricle, what guards it? It's your mitral valve. And if you have a stenosis between your between your atria going to the ventricle, then that will produce your diastolic murmur in your mitral stenosis. And if you have aortic regurgitation, no? So, ang sa aortic regurgitation naman, dapat palabas na from the ventricle going to the systemic vasculature. Pero nag-regurgitate back siya, papunta pabalik, no? So that's why it's a diastolic murmur because the blood enters back into your ventricles. I hope you get it, no? Because it's easier to understand. Even if you forget the systolic and the diastolic murmur, etong please sneak away slowly, Mr. Tiger, arms parts. As long as you get that murmur, that disease involves blood leaving or entering the ventricles, then you can answer whether it is systolic or diastolic. You can answer it, no? Just by this idea, no? Just by this definition. Okay, important cardio-PE findings. When you talk about ventricular systole, ano ba yung systole? Systole is the interval between your S1 and S2. So therefore, diastole is from S2 to S1. Okay? And when you talk about S1, S1 is closure of your AV valves, mitral and tricuspid. Okay? So etong S1, yung S1 lang po natin ang meron pong tawag nito, splitting. So etong splitting naman ng S1 normally occurs in young people, no? Or in cases of RBBB. Meanwhile, your loud S1 is usually seen, no, in early phases of your rheumatic mitral stenosis. Now, in congenital bicuspid aortic or pulmonic valve disease, you will usually hear an ejection sound or a high-pitched early systolic sound. Meanwhile, pag MVP naman, no? Pag MVP ang tinanong, tapos merong click sa options, yun na yung sagot. Okay? Because MVP is always non-ejection sound click with a click murmur complex. Okay? Clicks, click murmur complex. Yan po ang MVP natin. At then your MVP is best heard at your apex, no? Best heard at your apex. Now, there is a technique in order to exaggerate the sound of your MVP. So you let the patient either squat or stand. And when the patient is squatting, that click murmur complex moves away from your S1. Okay? Moves away from your S1. Meanwhile, if you relieve the patient of the Valsalva maneuver or the squatting, when the patient is just standing, the click actually moves closer to your S1, no? The click murmur complex. So that is your MVP. Okay, your increased P2 intensity, kasi di ba yung S1 kasi natin, meron siyang split, di ba? Tapos itong S2, meron din siyang splitting, no? Which is aortic and pulmonic. Now, in your increased P2 intensity, the P2 is louder than the A2. This is usually because of an ASD or pulmonary hypertension. And when we're talking about wide S2 splitting, then it's usually pulmonic stenosis and pulmonary arterial hypertension. Diyos ko, Doc, hindi ko na ma-memorize yan, no? So, ano na lang, association na lang talaga, word association. Okay? Wide S2 splitting, pulmonic stenosis, and pulmonary arterial hypertension. Meanwhile, lumabas ito ha, fixed splitting. Pag fixed splitting, ang automatic na sagot dyan is ASD. atrial septal defect. Basta pag fixed splitting. And if it's a paradoxical splitting, automatically that's an LBBB. LBBB. And if you have a new onset LBBB, please always get the cardiac enzymes of the patient because a new onset LBBB can be actually an MI. Okay? Now, when you have a single S2, no, it could be a severe AS or AR or a congenital absence of a pulmonic valve. Okay? Yung single S2. Now, there are four most common causes of your diastolic murmurs. Ano ba yung four most common? Arms parts. Arms parts. So, aortic regurgitation, AR. Then arms. So, mitral stenosis. And then parts, pulmonary regurgitation and tricuspid stenosis. Arms parts. Okay? Four most common causes. Now, when you talk about aortic regurgitation is usually heard loudest at the left lower sternal border in the third to fourth intercostal space. So the maneuver is you let the patient sit upright and lean forward, no, and hold the breath in full expiration. An Austin Flint murmur is best heard, no, at the cardiac apex. It's low pitched and rumbling. And when you talk about aortic regurgitation, what comes into mind are bounding pulses, no? Bounding pulses or Corrigan's pulse dito sa carotid, or water hammer pulse, ulnar and radial. So that is aortic regurgitation. Itong water hammer, ito yung favorite nila, no? Lumalabas ito. Classic kasi siya na PD finding, no? Classical PE finding. Okay, pulmonic regurgitation, it is a blowing decrescendo diastolic murmur. Heard loudest at the left upper sternal border at your second to third intercostal space. Meanwhile, if you talk about RHD predominantly MS yan. Okay? Mitral stenosis. And when you talk about mitral stenosis, the usual trigger word is opening snap. Okay? Opening snap. Low-pitched diastolic rumble preceded by an opening snap. That is your mitral stenosis. And not a MVP, ha? Kasi yung usual sinasagot basta pag opening snap is MVP, mitral valve prolapse. Mali po yun. Pag mitral valve prolapse, it's click murmurs. Click murmur complex. Pag opening snap and diastolic rumble, that is mitral stenosis. And it is heard loudest at your fifth intercostal space in your midclavicular line. And then take note, ang AR, ang patient is moving or leaning forward. Meanwhile, your mitral stenosis, the patient is left lateral decubitus position. Okay? So pag nakikita po ninyo no sa OPD, 'di ba, yung mga internist natin, pati yung mga cardio, meron talaga silang maneuvers no sa patient because we want to exaggerate the murmur. We want to really hear the murmur, no, para malaman namin yung intensity. Okay, tricuspid stenosis, fixed split S1. Fixed split S1, and that is due to delayed closure of a stenotic tricuspid valve. Increase ang intensity when the patient takes a deep breath. Pag PDA, nako, kung hindi nyo pa masagot yung PDA, ha? Diyos ko. Pag PDA, machine-like, high-grade murmur. Pero ito yung kicker radiating to the left clavicle. Yan yung PDA. Radiates to the left clavicle. When you talk about pericarditis, friction rub siya, scratching. And the scratching, the friction rub, grating scratching is heard both in your systole and diastole. Okay? And heard best between your apex and your sternum. Meanwhile, your pulmonary regurgitation is blowing decrescendo diastolic murmur, and then left upper sternal border naman siya best heard. Okay? Upper yung mga aortic at pulmonic. Meanwhile, mitral tricuspid is in the fourth and fifth. Okay. Tapos na to. Okay, let's talk about hemodynamics. Stroke volume increases by increasing which of the following? Is it A, end diastolic volume, B, end systolic volume, or letter C, both end diastolic and end systolic volume, or is it letter D, peripheral vascular resistance? How do we increase your stroke volume? Is it by increasing EDV, ESV, EDV plus ESV, or peripheral vascular resistance? Which one corresponds to preload? Preload is EDV, ESV. No? Kasi di ba yung stroke volume natin, stroke volume is primarily dependent on your preload and your afterload. Tingnan natin yung mga sagot. Okay, very good. EDV ang sagot, ha? EDV. Because your stroke volume is calculated by end diastolic volume minus your end systolic volume. So pag malaki yung diastolic volume natin, therefore, your stroke volume will also be increased. Okay? So ejection fraction, stroke volume accounts for the percentage of your EDV. So EF equals your stroke volume divided by end diastolic volume multiplied by 100%, and the normal range is 55 to 65%. Meanwhile, your cardiac output is stroke volume multiplied by heart rate. Okay, heart rate. Meanwhile, your cardiac index is your cardiac output per square meter of body surface area. Ito lang talaga, no? I think I already discussed this to you, no? Nung nag-cardiovascular physiology tayo. Please do not forget this one. When you encounter questions like this, write this one in your test paper. You can write in your test paper, ha? From what I know, listen to the instructions, but then the instructions usually is you can write on your test paper, no? So what I did was naglagay talaga ako, no, ng mga ano ko ng eto SV, HR, tapos SV mo, venous return preload, and then vasoconstriction, peripheral vascular resistance afterload, and then your preload usually is the one that determines your end diastolic volume. And an increase in your end diastolic volume will increase your stroke volume, and that increase in your stroke volume with your heart rate will determine your cardiac output. Okay. What is the primary controller of cardiac output? Is it A, stroke volume, B, venous return, C, heart rate, or is it letter D, peripheral resistance? What is the primary controller of cardiac output? Meaning any changes in this one will change your cardiac output immensely. Oh, kasi yung tinatanong niya, no? Actually, ito naman lahat eh. All of this will create changes in your cardiac output, but the question is primary. So ibig sabihin, just small or large changes in this value will alter greatly your cardiac output. Valid naman yung mga sagot ng karamihan, no? So it could be either your venous return, it could be your heart rate, it could be your peripheral resistance, but the answer actually is your preload. It's your preload that will primarily control your cardiac output. Kasi kung titingnan natin, no, venous return, itong venous return kasi can affect both your heart rate and also can also affect the preload or the stroke volume of the patient. Okay? So dalawa kasi yung effect niya. Tingnan niyo, itong venous return can also contribute to the atrial reflex, contributing to autonomic innervation and changes in your heart rate. And also, it also contributes towards your preload, which dictates largely the end diastolic volume. And any small changes in your EDV will greatly alter your stroke volume. Therefore, primary determinant talaga si venous return for cardiac output. Okay? So, venous return ang answer. Okay, Frank Starling's law. Frank Starling's law of the heart is manifested by which of the following conditions? Is it A, an increase in heart rate when the venous return is increased? Or is it letter B, an increase in stroke volume when your ventricular end diastolic volume is increased? Or is it letter C, an increase in your ventricular EDV when aortic pressure is increased, or increased in cardiac output when heart rate is increased? Okay, Ang dami-dami ng mga increase, Doc. Nalilito na kami, no? So, just remember, ano ba yung Frank-Starling's law? No? Ano ba yung Frank-Starling's law? So, your Frank-Starling's law is the more na nagre-return, di ba? Na blood going into your atria, the more ang preload mo, the more ang venous return mo, then the stronger. The stronger yung contraction ng heart. Okay, so the correct answer is an increase in stroke volume when your end diastolic volume is increased, because your end diastolic volume is again determined by your preload, and your preload is determined by your venous return. Okay? So 'di ba ang simple lang niya talaga kung alam mo lang talaga itong table na ito, no? So matitrace mo kasi okay. O nga no, pag mataas yung preload mo, then of course tataas din yung end diastolic volume. Then also you will see an increase in your stroke volume and your cardiac output. So the more that the heart, the atrial muscle is stretched, okay, because of increased venous return, then the more ang cardiac output or contraction. Changes in your total peripheral resistance affects the following. Is it A, end systolic volume, B, cardiac output, C, MAP, or D, all of the above? Changes in total peripheral resistance affects which of the following? Is it A, end systolic volume, B, cardiac output, C, mean arterial pressure, or D, all of the above? Okay. So if we analyze it, your end systolic volume is determined primarily by afterload, di ba? Afterload siya. Kasi end diastolic volume is preload. End systolic volume is afterload. Afterload naman is determined primarily by vasoconstriction or vasodilation. So it's total peripheral vascular resistance. So ang letter A is correct. Okay, it's correct. So question is cardiac output. Will cardiac output be changed or will be affected if there is changes in your total peripheral resistance? Then of course, no? Because your cardiac output is heart rate times the stroke volume. And your stroke volume is determined also by your preload and your afterload. Eh, yung mean arterial pressure, Doc, ano ba yung mean arterial pressure? So your mean arterial pressure, saan ba yung nalagay ko? Your mean arterial pressure mo naman is cardiac output multiplied by your total peripheral resistance. Okay? MAP is cardiac output times total peripheral resistance or your systemic vascular resistance. That's why it's very important, no, itong vasodilation and vasoconstriction. It really affects everything. So all of the above po ang sagot natin dito. Okay? All of the above. So I think I gave this table na to you, no, before. So what are the different factors that affect, for example, your preload, your afterload, your contractility? So just go over it, ha? So dapat na-master na po natin yan. So again, your Frank Starling, the more the heart muscle is stretched during filling, the more it is stretched, the greater the contraction. Okay? Because within limits, the heart will pump all of the blood that comes inside of it, no? By way of the veins. Lahat ng papasok, ilalabas. Ipupuga lahat, no? Oo. Kaya po yung puso natin, ingatan po natin, no? Kasi binibigay niya lahat-lahat, no? Lalo na po sa mga nagmamahal diyan, no? Noong Feb 14, no? Binigay na lahat-lahat, ayun, nasaktan, no? Kasi yung puso po natin, binibigay talaga lahat-lahat. Wala nang inuubos para sa sarili. Nax. Humuhugot si Doc. Okay. Sige po tayo, vein bridge. Vein bridge reflex is nervous reflex transmitted by the vagus nerve that is activated by stretch of your right atrial wall, no? So ito yung sinasabi natin na your preload or your venous return can also affect your heart rate, di ba? Doon sa table, your preload, which is determined by your venous return, can also affect your heart rate through your vein bridge reflex. Because the stretch in your right atrial wall will actually increase your heart rate by 40 to 60%. That's why when you need to increase the blood pressure, the mean arterial pressure, what do you initially do? You increase the venous return by, anong ginagawa natin sa pasyente? Tinataas yung paa, no? Trendelenburg position, tapos we give fluids, no? We give fluids in order to increase the venous return. Okay. Appearance of the QRS complex coincides with which event in the cardiac cycle? Appearance of the QRS complex coincides with which event in the cardiac cycle? Dok, ang hirap-hirap naman yan. Pag na-memorize nyo lang, no? Yung isang table sa physio na yung na-superimpose na lahat, yung sa venous wave, tapos sa ECG, tapos sa cardiac volumes. Meron kasi yung isang figure, di ba, na intersperse na siya lahat. So you will get this one. Okay. So kailan ba nangyari ang AV valve closure? Is it during diastole or systole? No? And then kailan ba nangyayari ang ventricular diastole? Kailan ba nangyayari ang rapid ejection? Okay? So tingnan natin yung sagot. Kailan ba lumalabas ang QRS complex? Which event coincides, no, with your QRS complex? Some answered A, some answered D. The correct answer is A. Okay. The QRS complex will coincide with AV valve closure or your isovolumetric ventricular contraction. Okay. This is the table that, the figure that I want you to master, no? So dito kasi makikita mo na lahat, no? Naka-summarize na siya. What are the events, no, that happens between your systole going into your diastole. Okay? So here, as you can see, yung QRS mo, saan ba yung ano ko? Laser pointer, ayun. Yung QRS mo, eto, this is P and then QRS. This is T wave, then P, then QRS. Your QRS coincides with your isovolumic contraction. That happens when you have closure of your AV valve. Okay, closure of your AV valve, di ba? Kasi nag-close na siya, so your QRS, your ventricle will need to pump in order to produce the ejection. Lalabas na yung blood from the ventricles going into the pulmonic and towards your aortic or your systemic circulation. Now, after ejection, then of course you will see na, no, your isovolumic relaxation, and that will mark your diastole. Okay? So diastole, you will have your aortic valve closure, and then thereafter it will open in order to produce flow, inflow, rapid inflow, 80%, di ba? 80% of the flow of the blood from the atria going to the ventricle. So this is from diastole. From the second S2 going into your S1. S1 to S2 systole. This is diastole events. Okay? Diastole events. So the thing that marks the diastole, the beginning of diastole, is AV valve opening. And the thing that marks, the event that marks the beginning of your systole is closure of your AV valves. Okay? So yun lang po. That's what we need to remember. Okay, how much volume of blood is stored in systemic circulation? Systemic, 84%. Majority is in your capacitance vessels. And capacitance vessels comprise 64%, no, in your veins. Okay, majority. 13% in arteries, 7% in your arterioles. Konti lang ang blood na nasa cardiac and pulmonary circulation. And majority is, of course, in your pulmonary vessels. Now, basic principles of hemodynamics. Kasi yung sa hemodynamics, principles lang naman talaga siya. If you just understand the basic principle, you can answer, no? Kahit na balik-balik ta rin pa yung mga question. Blood flow is controlled according or proportional to the tissue needs of the patient. No? So if there is increased metabolic demand, then of course you will have increased blood flow. So if, for example, you have a tumor, that tumor will produce angiogenesis and it will have increased metabolic activity. If it will have increased metabolic activity, then of course you will have increased blood flow. Kaya pag bulky ang tumor, lots of blood vessels, increase ang blood flow, nagiging madugo ang surgery. No? Kaya mahirap mag-surgery nang hindi nagde-debulk, no? Walang debulking ng primary tumor kasi nagiging madugo. Okay. So cardiac output is the sum of all the local tissue flow because the veins will return blood towards the heart and the heart will pump it all back towards your systemic circulation. Inuubos talaga ni heart, no, lahat ng pumapasok papunta sa kanya. And the heart will respond, no, to the tissue needs of the patient. So, if the tissue needs, no, increase ang tissue needs niya kasi nag-hemorrhage ang pasyente. So, decrease na yung perfusion niya. Of course, your heart will react. It will increase the chronotropic and inotropic activity of the heart. Therefore, the patient will have tachycardia if the patient has hemorrhage. Okay? Oo. Arterial pressure regulation is generally independent of either local blood flow control or cardiac output control, no? So yung BP natin is not dependent on your cardiac output, okay? So kahit na mataas ang cardiac output, that does not mean that your arterial pressure will be increased or decreased because your arterial pressure has many other controls. For example, nervous reflexes, reservoirs, and of course, primarily your RAAS system, or your renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system. Okay, what is Posul's law? No? So, tapos na tayo ni Laplace, ni Bainbridge, ni Frank Starling. Let's talk about Posul's. So, Posul's is vascular resistance is directly proportional to the viscosity of blood and the length of the blood vessel. No? So, the more viscous and the longer the blood vessel, the higher the vascular resistance. Kasi directly proportional siya eh. And it is also inversely proportional to the radius. Thus, the smaller the radius of the blood vessel, the higher the vascular resistance there is. And any changes in your vascular resistance will affect the afterload. And the afterload is your end systolic volume. And your end systolic volume will affect the stroke volume, and that will also affect the cardiac output, therefore ultimately affecting also your mean arterial pressure. Okay, so connected po sila. A decreased radius of a blood vessel markedly increases vascular resistance because vascular resistance is inversely related to the fourth power of the radius. So even small changes, no, in your radius can cause very large changes in your resistance. Okay, take note of this. Your arterioles provides the greatest resistance to blood flow, not your capillaries, no? Not your arteries. It is your arterioles. Okay, and veins, again, capacitance, great distensibility, contains 84% of your total blood volume, and then your capillaries are composed of simple squamous endothelium that promotes exchange of your nutrients. And take note that with increased hematocrit and increased viscosity, it will increase your vascular resistance because of what law? Posul's law. Diba? Directly proportional ang viscosity with resistance. Okay? And an increase in your vascular resistance will decrease your blood flow. So the greater the viscosity, the less is the flow of blood because of frictional drag between your RBCs. Okay. Sige, just a few important topics in your GI physiology and we will be done. It's already 4. So, which of the following correctly lists the 3 portions of the mucosa? I think I asked this already, no? So, makakasagot na kayo syempre nito, 'di ba? So, paulit-ulit kasi naman ito na question, no? So, kaya dinadrive talaga natin. Again, it's letter D, no? Mucous membrane, lamina propria, and your muscularis mucosae, no? And again, your mucosa is for protection, secretion, absorption, and it contains your lymphoid tissue. it contains your lymphoid tissue in your lamina propria. Meanwhile, your submucosa includes your submucosal plexus or your Meissner's plexus. And your Meissner's plexus is in charge of secretion. Meanwhile, your Auerbach's plexus is in your muscularis externa. And Auerbach's is myenteric muscle, so movement, peristalsis, formation of your sphincter tone. And you have serosa or adventitia, which is in charge of anchoring and lubrication. So which of the following is the correct order of the layers of the GIT wall from lumen to external surface? Then it is your mucosa, submucosa, muscularis externa, and your serosa. No? Kasi from lumen to external surface. So lumen, of course, the ones that come into contact first with the food is your mucosa. Next to that, submucosa, then muscularis externa, then serosa. Remember that your longitudinal muscle layer will extend, no, longitudinally down the intestinal tract, and your circular muscle layer extends around the gut, no. Therefore, excitation of one layer will often excite the other because of your low resistance gap junction, no. So it will act as a syncytium wherein one layer is affected or excited, then the rest will then be affected or excited as well. So you have two GI electrical waves, and the true action potential. Usual question is, which of the following GI electrical wave is a true action potential? And the answer is your spikes, no? Your spikes. Your slow waves are slow undulations that are due to your interstitial cells, but it does not cause muscle contraction. Because of these slow waves, it will induce the appearance of your spikes, and your spikes are the ones that can generate true action potential and can cause muscle contraction. So again, your spikes are stimulated by stretch, acetylcholine, and parasympathetic nervous stimulation. And hyperpolarization or resting is by your norepinephrine and your sympathetic. Okay? So just remember, if GI tract, dapat parasympathetic ang stimulation niya. And it is inhibited by sympathetic, no? Sympathetic. Kasi, kailan ka ba nagda-digest? You are digesting food if you are resting. And if you are resting, what is activated? It's your parasympathetic, di ba? Oo. Ayaw mo naman siguro na nasa fight or flight ka tapos nagtatae ka, di ba? No? So it does not jive. So parasympathetic, GI. Okay? Sige. Normal resting membrane potential is -50 to -60. Depolarization means the potential becomes less negative going to the positive side, and hyperpolarization means it becomes more negative. Okay? So the difference between your GIT and your nerve fiber is that nerve fiber, sodium entry. Okay? Depolarization is caused by sodium entry. Meanwhile, your GIT, smooth muscle, depolarization or action potential is caused by calcium entry. Okay? Calcium entry. Factors that depolarize the membrane: muscle stretching, acetylcholine released by your parasympathetic nerves, and your specific GI hormones. Meanwhile, hyperpolarization, again, sympathetic neurotransmitters, norepinephrine and epinephrine. Motor effects, you have your Auerbach's plexus, Auerbach's myenteric motor, so increase in your tonic contraction, rhythmical contraction, intensity of the contraction. Okay? Myenteric plexus. Meanwhile, your Auerbach's plexus is sa secretion. No? So, oh my gosh, look at those muscles. No? Kasi myenteric muscle contraction. So, submucosal plexus or Auerbach's plexus, Meissner's plexus, sorry. Meissner's plexus is regulation of your secretory activities. No? It is found in the submucosa of the intestines only. So main excitatory is acetylcholine. Main inhibitory is norepinephrine. And you have other neurotransmitters that will interact with your enteric neurons. Okay. I like this slide. No? I got this actually from Doctum. So yung ANS mo that governs your whole GI tract, it has two divisions. Whether it be parasympathetic and sympathetic division, your parasympathetic division is again excitatory, sympathetic is inhibitory, and your excitatory or parasympathetic division is divided into two. No? So meron siyang cephalic down to the first half or proximal half of the colon, and then from the distal half of the colon down to the anal, then that is in your sacral branches. Okay? Your cephalic branches is primarily through vagus nerve, and your sacral branches is predominantly through your S2, S3, S4, and your pelvic nerve. Meanwhile, sympathetic is entire GI tract. Okay? Entire GI tract ang kanyang nai-inhibit. And the primary neurotransmitter again is norepinephrine, and that is from your celiac ganglion and your mesenteric ganglion. Okay, so itong sa gastro naman, usually ang tinatanong talaga is the hormone actions. No? So I like this table. So itong gastrin, stimuli, you have your stimuli, the sites of secretion, and what is the action of the hormone. So you just need to remember this one. No? So yung gastrin mo, stimuli for secretion of your gastrin is when you eat something. So when you eat something, then you will have protein in your stomach and it will cause distension of your stomach. No? And then the site of secretion is the G cells of your antrum, duodenum, and jejunum, and your gastrin will stimulate gastric acid secretion. Kasi merong pumasok na food eh. So you need to secrete acid. Meanwhile, your cholecystokinin is stimulated if you ate any food with protein, fat, or acid. No? So it will stimulate the release of pancreatic enzyme and bicarbonate secretion, and also because of the fat, it will stimulate gallbladder contraction to empty the bile, because the bile will be the one to digest and saponify the fatty acids. And also because you need time in order to digest your protein and fat, it will signal to your stomach na, oy, wag ka munang mag-empty ng pagkain. Busy pa ako, nagda-digest pa ako ng protein and fats. No? So it will inhibit your gastric emptying. Meanwhile, your secretin primarily it's in reaction to acid and fat, no? So acid and fat, so meron kang kinain, so you need to secrete pepsin in order to digest the protein, amino acids, and then also pancreatic bicarbonate secretion and biliary bicarbonate secretion to neutralize the stomach acid. And also, it will tell the gastric acid, the stomach, wag ka munang maglabas dito ng food. I'm still trying to counteract the effect of the bolus of chyme. And then you have your GIP and your motilin. No? Itong GIP naman, gastric inhibitory peptide, it will stimulate the insulin release, no? And also inhibit your gastric acid secretion. Okay, just remember, gastrin stimulates gastric acid production, cholecystokinin fat digestion, pancreatic enzyme, and then also secretin inhibition of your gastric acid. Inhibition of gastric acid. GI reflexes, marami tayo, yung gastrocolic, stomach, evacuation of colon, enterogastric, colon and small intestine, puno pa, inhibit stomach secretion. Colono-ileal, colon, it will inhibit the emptying of ileal contents into the colon. Okay? Now, reflexes from the gut to spinal cord or brainstem going into the GIT. So, vagus nerve, gastric, motor, and secretory activity increased. Vagus siya eh, so parasympathetic, di ba? And then pain reflexes, inhibition of your entire GIT. That's why when your patient is in pain, then usually you will have constipation. Okay? So the main stimulus of peristalsis is gut distension. And when you talk about law of the gut means that all of your intestines will work in unison in order to push the bolus of food from the oral towards the anal direction. And in order for you to push the food, no, you will have a contractile ring that appears on the orad side, or from the superior, no, or from the proximal side. And then you will have this receptive relaxation towards the anus para ma-receive niya yung leading wave of distension. So that's just really what you mean by the law of the gut, no? Remember that effective peristalsis requires an active myenteric plexus, and your atropine can actually paralyze, no, the cholinergic nerve endings of myenteric plexus, causing your constipation. Causes of increased blood flow during increased GI activity, you have different vasodilator substances, like for example, peptide hormones, cholecystokinin, VIP gastrin, and your secretin. And also, during increased mucosal and gut wall activity, kasi if for example, there is increased parasympathetic activity, no, very busy ang gut wall mo. So because of the increased contraction of your muscle, the increased contraction will actually decrease, no, the oxygen concentration within the intestinal muscle, causing the release of your adenosine, causing vasodilation. Vasodilation will then supply the much needed blood flow towards your gastrointestinal system. So, gastric factors, regulation of stomach emptying, increased stretching of your stomach wall will elicit local myenteric reflex, and this will accentuate, no, the activity of your pyloric pump and will inhibit the pylorus. When there is stretching of the stomach wall. Why? Because you need time in order to properly digest, come into contact ang food with the acid from the stomach. Stomach stretching also causes gastrin release, no, from the G cells, di ba? Yung sa table natin. Stomach stretching, G cells, release of gastrin, release of acid. Okay? And this has mild to moderate stimulatory effect in the stomach body and will enhance the activity of your pylorus para mag-shut off talaga siya, no? So, shut off of your pylorus. Now, when you talk about gastric emptying, the most potent, or plays a more potent role in regulation of gastric emptying is actually your duodenal factors. It's not your gastric factors. It's your duodenal factors. Why? It's your duodenum that tells you na, oy, open mo na, close mo muna, wag ka munang maglabas ng pagkain. So if you have duodenal distension, kasi puno pa yung duodenum mo, of course, it will block gastric emptying. Sasabihin niya stomach, huwag ka munang maglabas dito, puno pa ako eh. And also, if you have mucosal irritation, no? So for example, cholecystitis, pancreatitis, usually gastric blockage of gastric emptying, that's why you will have vomiting. And then also duodenal chyme acidity, no? Chyme acidity kasi galing pa yung food eh, from the stomach, no? Going to the duodenum. So ang pH niya mababa pa, 3.5 to 4. So it will block further gastric emptying because it needs time to interact with the pancreatic bicarbonate secretion. And also chyme osmolality. If there are still hypotonic or hypertonic fluids, especially, no, breakdown products of proteins and fat, then it will block gastric emptying. Okay, of course, you have your hormonal feedback, your cholecystokinin, secretin, glucose-dependent insulinotropic peptide, or your GIP, no, gastric inhibitory peptide. Those also play a potent role in delaying or increasing gastric emptying time. Okay, so small intestinal motility, peristalsis, propulsive, segmentation, contraction, mixing siya, no? Mixing. So, ileocecal sphincter is normally closed, but when there is ileal distension, then it will relax the sphincter. And colon distension constricts the sphincter, no? Constricts the sphincter. Okay, I think I also asked this one no last time. Portion of the large intestine that functions principally by absorbing water and electrolytes in the chyme. Is it A, proximal colon, B, transverse colon, C, distal colon, or D, rectum? So essentially, the question is asking, saan ba dito ang mas mataas yung absorption rate ng water and electrolytes? Is it in the proximal or in the transverse, distal, or rectum? Okay, very good. No? So the answer is, of course, letter A, proximal. That's why if you have problems here in the proximal side, it will cause mushy fluid. Excess motility causes less absorption, so you will have diarrhea or loose feces. No? Poor motility causes greater water absorption, causing hard feces in your transverse colon, causing constipation. Meanwhile, your distal half is actually just for storage of fecal material. Your colonic motility is primarily determined by actions of your hostrations. No? These hostrations are large circular constriction because of your Taenia coli, no? Which are longitudinal 3 strips of muscle in which it reach peak intensity in about 30 seconds, then will disappear during the next 60 seconds. So its action is to dig and roll over function to expose your feces towards the mucosa, which will come into once it comes into contact with the mucosa, it will enhance the absorption of water and electrolytes. So you have mass movement that occurs 1 to 3 times per day, usually, especially for about 15 minutes during the first hour after eating breakfast, yung napupupo ka. And then usually you will see this constrictive ring in the distended or irritated point of the colon, transverse colon. And then your hostrations will then act or contract as a unit in order to push the fecal material down to the colon. Okay? So you have different colonocolonic reflex. So your colonic reflex, your colonocolonic distension of one part of the colon, of course, causes a relaxation in the other parts of the colon. Because, of course, you need to be receptive towards the possibility of a fecal material going in towards the anal side. Gastrocolic means increase in the motility of proximal and distal colon and the frequency of mass movements after a meal. So magiging busy yung tiyan natin. Okay, so ito naman, napaka-common na question, Stomach cell. So stomach cell, mucous neck cell. So here, of course, yung neck cell natin, the substances primarily being produced is your mucus that protects the lining as well as the bicarbonate that also counteracts the acid action in your stomach. Your parietal cells, meanwhile, is in charge of your gastric acid production and also production of your intrinsic factor. And then your enterochromaffin-like cells will produce your histamine. Yung histamine actually will stimulate the acid production. Kaya po ang ranitidine natin is actually a histamine receptor antagonist. Your ranitidine. Chief cells is pepsin and gastric lipase. B cells is somatostatin and G cells is your gastrin. Somatostatin, inhibition of acid. Gastrin, stimulation of acid. Okay? Sige. Parietal cells secrete acid through what transport mechanism? Is it through hydrogen potassium ATPase? B, sodium hydrogen antiport? C, hydrogen chloride symport? Or D, sodium bicarbonate antiport? Okay? So actually, ang tinatanong dito is, ano ba yung action ng omeprazole, lansoprazole, ng pantoprazole? Because those are drugs that act in your hydrogen potassium ATPase. So your proton pump inhibitor. Proton pump inhibitor acts in your hydrogen potassium ATPase transport. Okay? Sige, itong question na to. The absorption of glucose involves blank movement across the apical membrane and blank across the basolateral membrane. Basolateral membrane. So from the lumen, apical membrane, and then to the cell, and from the cell across the basolateral membrane going to the interstitial space. Okay? So ano ba yung sagot dito? Absorption of glucose. Would it be active transport or facilitated diffusion? And then a movement towards the interstitial fluid or interstitial space? Is it through diffusion or secondary or primary active transport? So the answer is actually secondary active transport across the apical membrane, and across the basolateral membrane, it's just simple facilitated diffusion. Okay? So as you can see here, no? Your glucose and galactose have secondary active transport mechanisms. You have your SGLT1, no? And then your fructose, primarily, siya yung nagkaiba, no? Among the sugars, because your glucose and galactose needs a carrier or active transport siya. Meanwhile, your fructose is only through facilitated diffusion as well, going into your interstitial fluid. So your glucose here, secondary active transport, and then from the cell going outwards into your interstitial fluid, it's just simple facilitated diffusion. Meanwhile, your amino acids can either be through facilitated diffusion or through also membrane proteins. And then outwards going into your interstitial fluid, it could be through simple or facilitated diffusion. Okay? Okay. So, eto naman, may tanong ako dito eh. In a patient who underwent extensive ileal resection, which of the following complications may be expected? In a patient who underwent extensive ileal resection, which of the following complications may be expected? Is it A, bile acid reabsorption causing watery diarrhea? Is it B, decreased cholesterol metabolism? Is it C, enhanced fat absorption? Or is it D, poor iron absorption? So dito matitest natin kung alam natin kung ano ba yung na-absorb, no, sa ileum versus the duodenum or jejunum. Okay? Ang pasyente natanggalan ng ileum. So anong ma-expect mo na complication? So let's check your answers, ha? Most of you answered letter D. Some answered letter C. Some answered letter A. And the correct answer is actually letter A. Okay, letter A. Bile acid reabsorption. Okay? So, actually mali yung choice, no? Kasi dapat failure of your bile acid or decreased bile acid reabsorption. Yun dapat yung choices, no? So, as you can see, during the board exam, may mga choices talaga na parang yun yung tama pero mali yung pagka-wording niya, no? Just stick with what you know, because etong cholesterol metabolism hindi naman siya sa ileum eh. It's not in the ileum. And your fat absorption is not primarily also in the ileum, and your iron is not primarily absorbed in your ileum, but bile acids are primarily absorbed in your ileum. That's why if you have extensive ileal resection, then you will have failure or poor bile acid reabsorption, thus causing your watery diarrhea in this patient. No? So as you can see, your duodenum is calcium and iron reabsorption, okay? Or absorption, sorry. From the intestinal lumen going into your interstitial fluid. Kasi DG yan, di ba? Duodenum, jejunum, ileum. So, just remember, pag duodenum siya, water and sodium plus calcium and iron. Jejunum is para siyang proximal tubular cell of the kidney. So, it's in charge of sodium, chloride, potassium bicarbonate. Okay? Sodium, chloride, potassium bicarbonate. Ileum is intrinsic factor vitamin B12. So, ito yung mga pinaka-common na question eh. Pag ileal resection, it could either be intrinsic factor deficiency or vitamin B12 deficiency or bile acid reabsorption failure causing watery diarrhea. Okay? Meanwhile, sa colon naman, colon is just really primarily water reabsorption. Water reabsorption. Nutrients dito sa DG natin, duodenum, jejunum, and your ileum.